Hey, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour, and I just plop myself in a chair and want to have an unedited conversation with you about Paul, Apostle of Christ, directed by Andrew Hyatt. It's put together on about a $5 million budget. It sounds like a lot of money to you, and it sounds like a lot of money to me, but by Hollywood standards, that's next to nothing, especially for a period piece. And this is a period piece. It's set in 67 AD at the end or toward the end of the reign of the Emperor Nero. Paul is under arrest in Rome, and everybody's getting persecuted because Nero is blaming the Christians for the big fire that destroyed like half of the city of Rome a little while earlier. So Priscilla and Aquila of Ephesus fame, who interacted with Apollos and Paul, are back in Rome, and they are sheltering a community of believers who are trying to escape persecution, but are also trying to stay in Rome because in the movie they feel like that's where God would want them to be and what they ought to be doing to be redemptive in society and tell people about Jesus. At the same time, Paul has been arrested and blamed for stirring up controversy amongst Christians, and he's locked in the Mamertine prison. Side note, almost all of the end of Paul's life locations that get talked about in this movie or get depicted in this movie also come up in the video I did about the later life of Paul in Rome, where I went there and filmed stuff. So if you go see the movie, you might enjoy going back and checking out my video on that stuff, which I'll link down below, because it's kind of fun to see all of that stuff in real life. Whatever the case, Luke makes his way into town. We figure out from the timeline that Luke has already finished his gospel, his account of the life of Jesus, and now he's wanting to reconnect with his old friend Paul to tend to his wounds. Luke is a doctor, and I don't know, catch up, encourage him, whatever. So Luke finds some way to work some connections to infiltrate the Mamertine prison and hang out with Paul in there. And through the process of this, Luke explains to Paul that the Christians don't know what to do. They're trying to follow Christ. We know historically the Bible wasn't assembled at this time, so they don't really have much to have in their hands. They've got the sayings of Jesus that they're referencing back to, but the movie makes it clear multiple times that nobody in the room in Rome actually walked with Jesus. Paul's the closest thing they got, and he didn't physically walk with Jesus. So they don't know what to do. If the government's being horrible, do you kill them? Do you have some kind of rebellion or something? Do you carry out guerrilla warfare and try to pick them off one at a time? Do you flee the city? Do you sit there and try to wait out the persecution so you can help people who are being injured in the city? And other Christians under the leadership of Priscilla and Aquila are kind of in an impasse over this very difficult question that's bigger than even the question of persecution. It's a question Christians have always wrestled with and maybe never really officially solved. And that is, what is the relationship between church and state? How should Christians interact with the larger world and what's going on around us? And I liked the way this film tried to tackle that question by proposing or having characters from the Christian perspective propose multiple different answers. And we got to see those play out a little bit. More on that in a minute. So Luke reports to Paul, this isn't going well. They don't know what to do. They're in a very difficult situation. And Paul and Luke come to the conclusion that a sequel to the Gospel of Luke should be written that tells people about Paul's experience and the story of what happened from the time of Jesus up to what they were experiencing right now. So Luke and Paul work on this, and then some other stuff happens. There really are spoiler potentials here, so I'm going to try to avoid that. I'll warn you if they're coming. The story is set after the New Testament narrative is concluded. So that's nice because it gives you some sense of jeopardy. Whereas if you go and watch a prequel to a movie that you like, you know who's going to die, who can't possibly die, all the tension's out of the room. There's actually tension in this movie. And before I get into talking about what I think they were going for, let me just say, I really do think I liked this movie, and that is not something I would say about just about any Christian movie I've ever seen. Is this a perfect film? No, they did it for $5 million and settle down here. But it's effective. And I think they were trying to thread a needle ideologically with this film that was risky, hard to pull off, and somewhat effective. In terms of the nuts and bolts of the film, it worked really well. The performances from the lead actors especially were great. Jim Caviezel, first time I saw him was in Count of Monte Cristo. And I loved the story. I loved his performance. And he's been great since. It was a little hard to not see him as Jesus, dressed up as Luke because of the Passion of the Christ, but I got over it. James Faulkner, a wonderful British character actor, plays Paul with his crazy beard. I think he crushed it. He was given a tough script because he said a lot of Bible, and it's hard as an actor to say the Bible in a way that doesn't slip into the cadence and rhythm that everybody's used to. And I don't know, if you give those lines to most people, it comes off as cheesy, but when the story is about how the book of Acts happened, it kind of makes sense that you would have Paul say some of that stuff that he would have written in letters and that manifests in the book of Acts. So that was interesting, and I think James Faulkner did his best with a very difficult role to get right. What's the dude's name? Is it John Lynch? It is John Lynch, isn't it? Just like the football player. That's why it's throwing me off. John Lynch plays Aquila and does a wonderful job of being conflicted and making us believe that things are difficult. His wife, I think, stole the show. She was played, Priscilla, was played by Joanne Whalley. And when she first came on the screen, I thought, I've seen this lady before. Trying to figure it out. And then there's this magnificent moment where tragedy strikes the Christian enclave hiding from persecution. And when Priscilla finds out and comes in, just the agonizing, ugly cry that she lets out over this tragedy was about as well as I've ever seen that emotion communicated. Normally you just get the no and kind of squint to hide that you can't actually cry on command. She nailed it, and it was in that moment that I was like, I know who that is. That's Saoirse, Mad Mardigan's girl from Willow. Whoa. The prison overseer of the Mamertine prison is played by a dude whose name I should know. I just can't pull it. I'm embarrassed. I'll try to put it up on the screen in post. He's wonderful. Great accent, very convincing, and his character was the catalyst that made the movie work. So performances were great up top. Like most lower budget movies, there's a pretty noticeable taper off when you get into the bit parts, but even there, the direction was good enough that most of those throwaway lines and little things were strong enough to get by. Unlike most Christian movies, it didn't feel like, oh, my cousin donated some money for this movie to happen, and so he gets to be in here being like a guard yelling, come on, get moving. Like, even those guys seemed like they knew how to act and did a pretty good job. There's one terrible wig that's like makes a guy look like a hobbit, and that was unfortunate, but now I'm nitpicking. The cinematography is a treat. There's this concept that, in a well-shot film, every frame looks like a beautiful work of art. And wow, Paul in prison, Luke in prison, all of the low-light stuff is gorgeous. I don't know why you're still here if you're not into any of this stuff, but even if you're not into any of this stuff, just going to see how beautifully they paint a picture with these very talented actors' faces in low light conditions is great. They don't cheat with light. They use a lot of natural light. They use believable candle light levels, and that was refreshing to see. I think one of the things that makes these Christian period pieces feel fake is that they overlight these dim conditions, and it doesn't work. Whereas part of what works in things like Game of Thrones that are big budget is they've got really realistic natural light in indoor kind of dank castle-y type settings. The movie struggled a little bit when we go outside. It had a little bit of that Christian movie film to it, and I didn't care for that. But again, I'm nitpicking at this point. Here's what I think really worked about the show. They did something structurally that most Christian movies aren't daring enough to do. Now, they did two things that most Christian movies aren't daring enough to do. And from here on out, spoilers ahoy. I would say if you're still with me and you don't want the spoilers, go see the movie. It's worth your time. Fair warning, and moving on. Number one, they didn't cheat with the plot to have a miracle bail out the protagonist so that everybody in the audience would need to be like, oh, I believe in God now. The moment that everything had to be figured out it really came down to Luke's ability as a physician. So the dude who was overseeing the Mamertine prison, his daughter's sick, and as soon as that plot piece came up and we realized, this centurion or whatever title he had, he's the one who ultimately is going to decide the fate of whether the book of Acts is allowed to happen. He knows it's being written down there. Will he let Luke keep writing, or will he just kill Luke because he's a part of this Christian cult that has to be done away with? And then in the very next scene, you find out his daughter is dying. He's sacrificing to the Roman gods. The Roman gods aren't responding. His wife's mad at him because she thinks he's angered the gods. There's pressure on him. And I leaned over to my buddy at that point. I was like, hey, I so hope that little girl gets healed, because Luke is a man of quality mind and quality character who, because of the work God has done invisibly in his heart, will go and serve his enemy to deal with this sickness instead of some sort of just ill-timed or beautifully timed miracle. The reason I would hate the miracle option is, one, it's just a lame contrivance to have something come out of nowhere that solves all your problems. It's always bad in storytelling. It's not interesting. But two, I would hate that because it's not how the world works. God just doesn't show up and solve all your problems whenever you need him to. Not for the best Christian in the world. All the best Christians still die. Even the really, really, really super impressive ones, they still get cancer. It doesn't go away. Sometimes it goes into remission and everybody's like, oh, it's a miracle. And then they just get cancer again. Do I think the miraculous could happen? Sure. Yeah, probably. Definitely we see it in the Bible, but even there, it's very sparing. It doesn't happen much. And so there's this great discussion that Paul and the centurion have where Paul says, I don't own this power. I don't control any of it. Sometimes God does miraculous things, but he doesn't promise him anything. And then further, it does turn out to be what I hoped. Luke finally in the last moments gets called in out of a cell where he's sentenced to die the next day to try to save this guy's daughter. And you got the spoiler warning already. He does it with his brain and with his character. And the moment where he betrays the location of the Christian hideout because his medical supplies are there and he needs them, he gives that information to the one who wants to kill all the Christians. It's this beautiful gesture of trust. And it was a character-driven move, but also a beautiful, high-stakes gamble that, for whatever reason, really, it moved me. And I was delighted that even after the little girl heals up and she's better and everything's improved, you never had the moment, and this is daring thing number 2, you never had the moment when the non-believer in the Christian film was like, tell me how I might be saved. Well, you've won the argument because a magical miracle happened at just the right moment, and you were so doe-eyed and friendly that, okay, I believe now. How could I vote for your political party? It's that kind of stupid in a lot of Christian movies, but this guy doesn't do it. He shows a little moment of emotion as he listens to the Apostle Paul. He shows regard to the Apostle Paul, even as he oversees his execution. But the movie's content to just let it sit. That's brave for a Christian movie. I don't know where they got their money. I know that a lot of times if you get funded to make a Christian film, there's a bunch of strings attached. And while I'd like to see a salvation scene where an evil atheist becomes a not atheist and cries and admits they were wrong and we were right all along. Blah! And I'll give you $1 million if you'll do it. yeah, okay, fine, I really want to make a movie. Like, that's the deal with the devil that I think people have to make with these. But here they were brave, and they didn't do it. I'm going to add a third thing that I think they did that was brave. They pushed back on Christians. I could be reading this all wrong, but here's what I think was going on thematically in this show. I think that they deliberately picked this moment of awful persecution, of Christians literally being burned alive by Nero's men to light the streets, to light his garden. I think they picked that to jab at Christians in the United States, in the West, who are feeling very persecuted right now. I get that the world is not as friendly to what we think as it used to be. I get that people get mad and say meaner things on the internet now. I get that what we think is out of vogue. I get that it feels like open season on Christians ideologically. Feels like. But as best as I can tell, like in America at least, like no one's getting a spike run through their backside and then held up on there and covered in pitch and burned to death while they're alive or even while they're dead. Like, not at all. And the brave thing I think they're doing there is trying to say, you're not getting persecuted like that. Now let's look at how these people are responding. And then we contrast that with a bunch of different responses. Joanne Whalley's character, she's a Bible character. Priscilla, sorry, I really do this for a living. Priscilla is saying, we have to stay put because if we leave, there's no light left in this city. And if we perish, we perish. She doesn't say that, but essentially. And it's a very brave position, and she doesn't make that decision for someone else, which I thought was a nice touch. But that's what she's advocating. Aquila is leaning more toward, let's find an escape route by using the wealthy families of Rome who are not Christians but don't like the government to find a way to preserve Christianity and get us out of a bad situation. Okay, well that represents another possible response. Then there's another guy who comes along, he's like, let's kill him. Let's have an armed insurrection and overthrow the government because they're dangerous and bad. Well, that represents another response that a Christian might take to the weirdness of the world. And then another response that's proposed is to politically align the Christians with non-Christian, politically scheming families who would like to politically overthrow the emperor. Well, you don't have to be a real gifted writer to read between the lines and see what's going on there. I mean, even I'm catching it. What they are doing that I think is so brave is saying, one, Christians, you're not all that persecuted. Two, which response are we picking right now? Are we choosing stay put, and if we suffer, we suffer, but we're going to be light no matter how weird things might get? Are we choosing, let's get out of here and build our own little enclave somewhere much safer where they won't know we're here, but we won't get killed and we can just quietly worship without being bothered? Are we choosing, let's turn violent and get rid of the people who make us feel bad and let's do to them what they're doing to us? Are we choosing, let's align ourselves with some people who aren't very desirable, but whose interests just happen to possibly overlap with our interests to try to win politically and in the world? Let me just run that one more time to make sure you're tracking with me. Or are we considering aligning ourselves with people who aren't very desirable and are very much not Christians, but with whom our interests might briefly overlap in the interest of trying to win politically and get ahead? I say that was brave because I feel like it was a direct pushback on American Protestants, American evangelicals, for maybe doing that exact thing of late in terms of how we're engaging with the world and how we're engaging with politics. You don't have to agree with that accusation. You might think that the moves that we're making right now politically and socially are a great idea. Okay, whatever. I might disagree with you. But ultimately, the thesis statement, the response to that difficult question of how do we engage with the world when it gets tough, comes from Paul and from Luke. And it's drilled into your brain. Love, love, love. Serve your enemies. Be willing to suffer if you have to suffer. Defend the innocent if they need defending. Do not disengage, but stay present, even if it hurts. I'm feeling really provoked. I'm feeling like I've been given something to think about by a Christian movie. And that just doesn't happen very often. So right there, I'm willing to give this thing a big encouraging thumbs up, even though the movie drags a little bit and isn't quite perfect. I think thematically it is so brave in its structure and in its message that you should go check it out. I also think if you're going to talk to Christians, rather than just reaffirming what they already think, pushing back on them a little bit, if you're making an overtly Christian movie for Christians, is what you ought to be doing. So I dug that as well. A couple other things on my way out the door. There was somebody really smart and in the know behind the scenes in this film. Maybe there were tons of somebodies. There were so many little points where you could have mishandled a theological issue here or there and lost people who are in the know. Like, well, you're taking that position and siding with those people. I see what you did there, but they dodged it. So like there's a little controversy about whether the end of Acts represents Paul's final arrest that led to his death, or whether Paul was released after the end of Acts, went on some other journeys, and then was re-arrested later on, and that is when he died. Well, there's this little moment where Paul and Luke are walking through a garden, and Paul even asks him, like, well, are you going to make it about this? Where does this story end? And they address it. And you might not all be satisfied with that if you're into this stuff, but the fact that they cared enough about the life of the mind and biblical scholarship to even address that was really meaningful to me. Additionally, they, what was it? I'm not editing this video, so I'm going to think of it right here, and it's going to be good, and it is going to be, there's another one. If I think of it later, I will totally tell you. Bottom line is this. It's a smart movie. I think it was well acted. I think it is worth your time. And I think the reason that Rotten Tomatoes critics don't quite know what to do with it, and that even audiences where usually, Christian movies will get like a 4% from critics and like a 97% from Christians who are just trying to vote for what they think, both of those audiences are closer to the middle on this one. Because, this is a good place to end. Because I think the people who made this movie are trying to accomplish maybe the same stuff that I'm trying to accomplish with this. I think they're trying to thread a needle where they welcome other people into the conversation, where they try to do good scholarship, and I'm sure they're much better at it than me, and where they try to push back a little bit and think honestly about stuff instead of just rallying the base. Like, let's sharpen each other a little bit. Let's think about what the heck is going on here and why we think what we think and what we're doing with this whole Bible, Christian, engage with the world thing in general. I think it was brave. I don't think I'm quite as brave as they are, but I think you're going to resonate with it a lot, especially if you like or hang around this channel at all. So I hope you check it out. Someday I'll think of that other thing that I forgot about, and it's going to be really brilliant. We're going to have fun with that. But in the meantime, I'm just going to turn this thing off and publish it, and I cannot wait to hear what you thought of this film. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible. In an hour, in a way, sense, sort of, kind of me sitting in a room just talking ad nauseum. Thank you for being here. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. We'll see you soon. I just thought of that other thing theologically that I liked. They allowed us to see that Luke gathered information for the book of Acts, that he assembled it and edited it, and that the process of inspiration involved him using his brain and actually tangibly putting pen to paper. And then they had the book of Acts copied by Aquila and Priscilla and the others right there in Rome and distributed, which is an interesting thought, an interesting vision for what the initial autograph might have looked like. That there wasn't a singular autograph of Acts, but that maybe there was an original run of the book of Acts, 100 copy, hand copy, version of the book that went out first. I don't know. Whatever the case, I just thought it was clever and, again, bold of them to even step into that theological territory.